College football nerds here doing a top 10 for y'all like we try to do every single week. We'll probably get into top 12 at some point, but we're just going to talk top 10 because it's hard enough to do 10 as it is. I got Josh with me. He's going to get nerdy with y'all as well later on this week because it's a terrible week. I mean, it's not terrible because it's college football. We need to appreciate that. But in terms of ranked matchups, I think all we've got is Texas A&M and who is it, Josh? Who are they playing? In Missouri. 7 people will watch that. So we're going to do a top 10 this week. We're going to do a preview or review of the Alabama-Georgia video, which you should have already seen by now. And we are going to do possibly a little video later in the week that we're going to reserve for y'all. Anyway, Josh, I'm going to let you go first with your top 10 because it's just such a hard exercise and everybody's going to hate your top 10. I'm going to let you take all the heat and then I'll follow in with an equally bad one, but we'll go with that.
Yeah, and I'll pretty quickly go through my top 10, let you do yours, and then maybe we can just try to talk it out afterwards. My top 10, top 3, I think, are right now separated from the rest of football. It's funny. We all keep hearing about how parity's going to come with college football, having the transfer portal NIL. At least my opinion, I think there was a bit of a transition where the haves, meaning the money programs, some of them that have been down, kind of got back on top. And now that it's sorted itself out, it feels like there's never been any more of a distinction between the 3 to 4 elite teams, the next tier or the tier after. Or, yeah, they're really competitive within themselves, but there's different tiers. And the top tier to me is number 1, Alabama. Number 2, I have Texas. Number 3, I have Ohio State. Number 4, I have Georgia. Even with the loss, I just think those 4 teams right now are on a different planet. I don't know that there's any other team in the country that I would ever pick to beat any of those 4 teams on any point. Now you could throw them all in a bag and reverse them. If you want to say Texas should be ahead, they have a big win, sure. If you want to say Ohio State's been the most dominant team, snap to snap, I'll believe it. I know I made some comments last week in our top 10, and just full disclosure, right? I was exhausted coming off a work conference. Going back and rewatching that game, I realized some of the stuff I saw live. I noticed that they were really successful when they got the ball out quickly, and I thought maybe it was the offensive line causing them to do it. And then I realized it's more of a game plan. But it's still coming back to Ohio State, like this past weekend again. When they get the ball to their playmakers on the outside, it's usually a big play. When they don't, it's not. And they're having a lot of success even with the run game. They got a lot of push, or have been getting a lot of push. That offensive line is looking pretty good lately, more so than it did early in the year. But yeah, I think all those teams from a skill position standpoint, from a talent down, I think the biggest thing to me too is a talent standpoint, defensively and offensively. Nobody else really has demonstrated that clear combination, with the possible exception of my number 5, which is Tennessee. Tennessee fans were probably screaming in that last segment. Look, you have every right to. Tennessee's going to play these other, at least 2 of the top 4, right? You're going to get a chance to prove you're there, so don't be too upset with it. It's just, coming out of that, even out of the Oklahoma game where they looked really, really, really good, it's clear after the Auburn game, Oklahoma's offense is that bad. And I hate to say you haven't been tested, but you haven't been tested. NC State has proven, not just because you beat them, but just through the rest of the season, has proven they are a really bad team. Oklahoma's proven to be completely inept on offense. I think Tennessee may be in that top group. I just don't know because I don't think they've played a top 40 team yet. And yes, I'm saying Oklahoma may not be a top 40 team. It's a discussion for a different day because of just how incredibly bad that offense is right now. Maybe. Number 6 for me is Oregon. Number 7 is Miami. Number 8 is Penn State. Number 9 is Michigan. Number 10 is USC. And this is where I will say, Daniel, and I know you'll have your own version, it gets really stinking hard. And everybody in the comments who wants to scream at it, look, we always say every week, right? Go in the top 10. Go in the comments, give us your top 10. And one of the reasons we say that is before you complain about one of those teams being ranked where they are, try to rank it yourself. Because there's about 8 to 10 teams in that 6 to 10 range you can make an argument for. And every one of these teams, I could make a really good argument for why they shouldn't be as high as they are. They're all kind of flawed, and to me, really clearly kind of a second tier. So that's what I got, Daniel. What do you have?
So I've got a little bit different, but more at the bottom. Alabama, Texas, Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Tennessee as number 6, Penn State number 7, Miami 8, Clemson 9, Ole Miss 10, and And like you said, there's really 8 or so teams that you could clump together. People are going to get mad at me about Ole Miss. And look, I get it. I don't think Kentucky is a terrible football team. I don't think they're a great football team. I don't think they're a terrible football team. I have to punish someone. And when I look at Ole Miss, I think that they have some flaws. I think their defense is improved. But my issue is, who do you put up there? Michigan, I really don't want to put up there because we have multiple bad data points for them right now. We have the blowout loss to Texas that could have been worse than it was. But I wouldn't really crush them for that if there was other good information. They have struggles against G5 teams. They had a struggle win against a really bad Minnesota team that they needed a gift from the refs to give them that onside kick where clearly they weren't offsides. That picture's floating around the internet. Missouri, they struggled. 1-score win against Boston College, double overtime against Vanderbilt. And if we saw, Boston College beat Western Kentucky by 1 point at home this weekend. They were down 20-7. I think they scored on their last possession to go up 21-20, and Western Kentucky couldn't answer. These are all pretty mediocre teams. Josh, the one I'm really struggling with, you've got Penn State 8, I've got them 7, I've got Miami behind them because to me, Miami, in my opinion, because that you shouldn't be able to overturn whatever the call was on the field, Miami lost to Virginia Tech. It's not going to show it in the record book, but they lost to Virginia Tech. And they needed a come-from-behind win late to even get the lead. Penn State looked ugly against a ranked Illinois that has they're very much like Kentucky. They have a really good defense, terrible offense. So as much as I think Penn State is playing kind of ugly too, they're playing ugly against what I think was, their bad game, a better team than Virginia Tech. To you, Josh, is there a huge, you talked about 1 through 4 and there being a line of demarcation. Is it then the next group is Tennessee, Oregon, and then there's a huge group after that for you?
Daniel, as you were saying that, I was actually just thinking it. And I will say the thing that strikes me about that is Tennessee and Oregon, I think, have high-level talent on offense and defense. I mean, I don't know if you agree with me. I don't know if the talent's quite as good in some ways as those other 4 who are just 5-star city on both sides of the ball to a crazy degree. I think Oregon and Tennessee have the talent to play with them, and they've got their own studs. I'm not sure it's as deep as those top 4 teams, which are just loaded to an insane degree in depth. Like Arch Manning is the backup quarterback at Texas. But they're still complete. And when you start looking at everybody after that, Penn State's offense is still not very good. And we had people starting to... Every year, Daniel, every year, we say we're not very high on Drew Aller. Every year, the fans come after us after the first couple games against bad teams where they look good, and they say, look, you're wrong, he's turned it around. And then he has another clunker. I think Drew Aller is what he is. I think he was a bad COVID eval. There were a lot of COVID miss-eval, high-ranked guys, high climbers when they weren't doing camps. I'll leave it at that. We've talked about it enough. Miami, offensively, I think is great. In the same way Penn State defensively is great. Defensively, I don't think Miami's very good. And I think they're not completely complete, even offensively. You have Clemson in the top 10. I almost put them in the top 10. Still a great defense. Not there on offense. And I really thought about putting Clemson ahead of the top 10. I put Michigan and USC, and Michigan's not a complete team. They can't throw a forward pass. They can run the ball well enough to beat a lot of teams because the defense is still very, very good, which we thought it would be. But as we saw with the Texas game, they play a real live offense. Real live offense is going to score 30 points. A championship level offense. And they have no way to match that. And they're going to get knocked out of their game plan. And USC is close, but now I've seen too many games from them to say that there's, especially the line of scrimmage, even last week. I mean, they early on until the defense gets a little tired, they get pushed around. I don't think they can play with the teams in front of them. So yeah, I mean, it seems like there's those top 4. There's 5 and 6 in Tennessee and Oregon. I was high early on Oregon, unduly high. I agree on that. But I think it's coming around to the fact that it was justified to say don't bury Oregon yet just because they struggle with Boise State. Boise State, you say Jam Miller's the best back in the country. I think it's JT. Boise State has the best running back in the country. That is a legitimately very good team. Tennessee has still, I hate to say it, they haven't played anybody yet. Same boat Ole Miss is, but I haven't seen any major chinks. I mean, it's 4 teams, 2 teams that I think can play with those 4 teams, and then like throw a bunch of people in a bucket, shake them around, and if we're picking seashells at the beach, right? Every one of those seashells is broken. Like you go to the beach, right? You pick up seashells, throw them in a bucket, give them to your kids, and your kids look at them all and they say they all suck because you can't find one, that doesn't have a piece broken off. I don't know anybody else has had that experience. That feels like number 8 through or number 7 through like number 16 right now. It's that whole set. There's enough shiny, but when you look at it, something's kind of wrong. And I don't think for any of these teams we're going to find it right. And I think that's going to continue all the way to the playoffs. I think some of these teams are going to get into the 12-team playoff. I think all these teams are going to lose by a decent margin to the teams at the top. That just seems like the way it's headed.
Yeah, you go to the surf shop and buy your kids an Ohio State seashell. That's what you do. Because all you got on the beach are Michigan seashells.
I sell seashells by the Ia Maliava. Is that right?
There you go. That's the closest you've gotten all year. Ohio State, that wasn't an intentional segue. A lot of them are still, I think they're frustrated that they're not getting more love for that number 1 spot. And again, I keep saying this, it doesn't matter. Like I'm excited to see that voters did move Texas down, not because I think Texas isn't worthy of a number 1 spot. We still don't know. Like we don't know. Well, they could be far and away the best team in the country. We don't know. But I like to see that we're reacting to new information. And we just haven't gotten any information on Ohio State. We do have the information that they're clobbering people that they should, and that is one of the hallmarks of a very good team or an elite team. So from that standpoint, they're not being punished. I think we have taken the information that we got from Tennessee, where after they beat Oklahoma on the road, we're like, okay, you beat Oklahoma on the road. But then we start pairing it with the information of, oh, well, Oklahoma barely beat Houston, who's getting destroyed. Oklahoma had to have kind of a miracle to beat Auburn, who's not very good. Like, there's a lot of information that we've gotten in the last couple of weeks that tell us maybe Tennessee isn't elite, but then again, I heard it was a wet field, Josh. The grass was tall in Oklahoma, so there was some interesting words there that might have kept.
They've done everything people have asked them to, right? Like the NC State in the Oklahoma game. I mean, I know I'm overly critical sometimes of everybody. That's my shtick.
Wait, you're overly critical?
It's shocking, I know. I mean, as I've said before, you sell your joy when you go to engineering school, and then you sell your soul when you go to law school. And so it sort of leaves me as this soulless, joyless husk. But they've done everything that's been asked of them. And I think Ia Maliava, did I actually say it right? Like,
yep.
I feel like I can only say it right when I'm not trying.
You nailed it.
It's frustrating. I'm frustrated. I've been so frustrated the last few weeks on this, partly because we're always recording when I'm exhausted. But they've done everything they asked. I feel like he's one of the most accurate quarterbacks, if not the most accurate quarterback in the country right now. But it just, even though they're blowing teams out, it just feels like in those games they kind of run that hypo offense, which is sort of a little bit janky. I think the front 7 is really good. I don't know if it's as complete or as deep. And the biggest thing to me is those top 4 teams. Like, I know if Alabama, Texas, Ohio State, or Georgia lost like 10 starters, the way Oklahoma is right now, they would still be a top 10 team, I think.
Right.
And I don't know that Tennessee's there. But that's not saying that Tennessee starters can't beat Alabama and Georgia. It's just, I don't know. I kind of have to see a little bit more.
And we'll get that with Tennessee because they have Alabama and Georgia on their schedule. And I don't think they have to beat both of them to be considered elite, by the way. Like, I don't think Georgia's going to go undefeated from here on out. But I think they're better possibly than every team left on their schedule. It's just, like we said before, sequencing is challenging. For me, we get a lot of information for Ohio State in 2 weeks on the road against Oregon. They play on the road at Penn State. They've got Michigan at home. They've got Indiana, who I think is a better team than is getting credit. That's another team that they haven't played a tough schedule, but they've blown everybody out. Like, handle their business again this weekend against Maryland, 42-28. They beat UCLA worse than anybody else has beaten UCLA, which is, saying a lot. So talk to me a little bit, though, about why you moved Alabama to your number one slot, because you've been like, other than the fact that you had to maybe move Georgia out of there.
Well, I think the thing there is just you to some degree you're sort of drawing at straws. I mean, Ohio State still hasn't had the chance to beat anybody of note. They will. They're going to play better competition. Michigan State, look, they're still in that mode that they've been in. They're not a good team, but that was a real team and they handled themselves well. So I think you can make an argument for Ohio State. Texas is continue to play at a high level. They beat up on Michigan. There's a good argument for putting them higher. No one else has anything like playing Georgia, and no one else will for a while. And so that's why, to me, I wanted to move them number one. I mean, you did the same thing. The other thing is that for really more than a quarter half, but about a full quarter and a half, the way Alabama was humming, there's I don't know that anybody else is going to beat that version of Alabama. The offense they had for that time period was just brutal. They have a fantastic offensive line. They've really gelled. They were good the entire night. They were excellent. There was a play where Georgia brought 6, and I tweeted about this at the time, and it just kind of blew my mind when I watched the replay. I realized what had happened. It's like how did they have so many guys in single coverage? And the answer is Alabama blocked 6 with 5. I mean, the left tackle Proctor literally had a D end and an outside linebacker in each hand, just slowly giving ground. And that's kind of crazy. And they haven't had a line like that in several years. And when you pair that with the skill position players, with Ryan Williams or Jeremiah Smith, you guys can get at it as much as you want on who's the better player. And the fact that the defense is outstanding, the front seven is exceptional. I think the back end is their weakness because they're very young, which we talked about in we did a preview as we did a number of other teams, and that was the thing we called out. We said they're going to go as far as the secondary would carry them. You saw that in that game. But other than that sort of chink in a game where Georgia had to go for it on fourth down a million times, I mean, they were just excellent. And given where everybody else is, that's enough for me to move them to number one. But I will say it's not like it's by any big margin whatsoever, and I could flip-flop them at any time.
So here's an interesting fact that is no slight to Ohio State in any way. It's just an example. So Ohio State has famously played Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall, and Michigan State. In those 4 games, Alabama was beating Georgia worse at the half than Ohio State was in 3 of their 4 opponents. So Marshall, Michigan State, and Akron, Alabama was beating Georgia worse than Ohio State was beating those 3 teams. That's impressive to me. Because I think you're right. That version of Alabama, offensively and defensively, because they were also really shutting Georgia down. And I actually think their first touchdown that they gave up was because they were being overly aggressive with a 28-point lead. That version of Alabama is not going to get beaten. But that version of Alabama didn't play for 4 quarters. So that's why I've got 1, but you could really say 1A, B, C, and maybe D, depends on what version of Georgia you get. So give me your thoughts as we wrap this up. We've been saying that there's not as high of stakes for some of these big games like Alabama and Georgia, because they were even talking about in the broadcast how these 2 teams might play each other 2 more times this year. It's hard for me because I think logically that is true. The stakes are not as high. But watching that game, the feeling, just the emotion and prisoner of the moment thing, it felt like any other of these heavyweight matchups we've seen that led to hardware with Alabama and Georgia. So has your opinion shifted at all after where you were before that game in terms of saying, the stakes are so much lower or are lower? Now that you've sat through watching that game, have your thoughts changed at all?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, it did seem like it was still a huge moment. I agree with you. I think a lot of that, though, Daniel, was because of the magnitude of how good the game was.
Right.
Like the fact that Alabama looked as good as they did was kind of jaw-dropping, and Georgia came back, clawed back, and oh my gosh, they actually retook the lead, and then oh my gosh,
right.
Alabama took it back. That meant a lot. I think, to me, though, when you lead up to a big game like that, usually we do a lot of prep work for those games, and we start even after we put the video out, we kind of can't help ourselves but looking at video of the two teams. That part wasn't there to me. And it was telling to me how many times on Twitter we had people talking about like Miami, right? The Miami game in particular. That's the game to me that loses some luster versus Virginia Tech, because it was a big deal that they beat Virginia Tech on. I actually think it probably was the right call. Hearing the explanation, yes, there is absolutely a rule. If an out of bounds player touches an uncontrolled ball, it is immediately dead, and that was apparently the explanation from the ACC refs. That's come up a few times. There was a big interception years ago with Julio Jones and Patrick Peterson, if I recall, that was hugely problematic in one of the games where Alabama beat LSU. Late, it wasn't the final play, but it was a similar deal where Julio stuck his hand out and touched the ball while he was out of bounds, then Peterson snatched it away. Anytime you're grappling for the ball and one guy's out of bounds, no one can possess it. The ball's immediately dead. But that game would have had huge ramifications previously because it knocks the team out of the playoffs. And people were saying, oh, gosh, man, of course they wanted him in it, because if they lost that game, they wouldn't have made it in. And so now, an 11-1 Miami that loses the conference championship game can't get in. Like, that's not true. If Miami makes the conference championship game and they lose and they go 11-2, if you look at the last, 15 years, as far back as I went, there has never been an 11-2 Power 5 team that has ever not been top 10. Ever. So those are the games that are going to lose luster, where you tune in and go, oh my gosh, such and such is about to be eliminated. But I still think, though, when you look at Twitter and you look at people's reactions, I don't think they process that. Like, Ole Miss losing to Kentucky doesn't really matter too much for Ole Miss, and it still feels like it does. I've always said it's going to take about 3 years, and I think that really hit home to me. We're going to have a couple sets of playoffs for people to recalibrate their brain to know that we're playing for seeding and not playing for entrance, if that makes sense. And then realize the season, we've never had a 12-team playoff, so nobody in their brains is thinking the season's about the playoff, not the regular season. Daniel, all I know from that and my feeling was, the magnitude of the game was big. And I think as far as my wife's concerned, any game where Ben shows up, that, will always be a huge game. Because I think in her mind, if you just had a video camera of Ben, she would just go in the other room and watch that. And then the entire top 10 would just be Ben, all the way down. So it was a big game, but the broadcast crew and everything around it, the scope of it, how good the game was, I think feeds into it. But I think those games are always going to be big. It's more to some degree, more the like kick six upset kind of deals that will lose a little bit of their luster. And I think more than anything, lose a little bit of their infamy. Because just like this game was so good, to your point, I think there's a good chance Alabama and Georgia may play 3 times. And this game will be almost an afterthought. It seems crazy to say now, but it's going to be almost an afterthought if they do play 3 times, because the other 2 are going to be the ones for trophies. This one was just for kicks.
I think the real frustrating thing, if you're an Alabama fan, is if you beat Georgia twice and they still get in the playoffs and they beat you in the playoffs, then you're really going to feel like your other wins didn't matter. I think that's what it's going to come down to. But in terms of just watching that game and seeing the atmosphere and how much the game itself was so epic, I'm glad we haven't lost that, at least not yet. The one kind of counterpoint I'll give you on the 2-loss team never being left out thing, all of that is really pre-super conference realignment, where we've taken 4 good teams, or at least 4 brands, and thrown them into the Big Ten, and we've taken Texas and Oklahoma and thrown them in the SEC. So now you'll have, because of imbalanced schedules, you might have a bunch of 10-2, 11-1 type teams where you only had 1 or 2 before. I think that's a possibility. And if you look at it that way, the Big 12 and the ACC, their schedules are absolute trash. They're garbage. A lot of them didn't play great teams out of conference. And I think it's going to come back to hurt them. So it's just, but like you said, I do think regardless of what this year does, I do think it's going to take us 2 to 3 years to mentally calibrate that we are probably looking at games for seeding, especially in the elite teams, for seeding more than it is for being in or out. All right, let us know in the comments what your top 10 would be, where we're wrong, and whether or not you think these regular season games have lost a little bit of their luster because of the fact that they're not such high stakes games anymore. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.